What is the heart of grief and where does it come from? And how do the way we tell stories about ourselves impact the way we continue to grow in relationships and as individuals? Hey y'all, I'm Reese, and welcome to Making Meaning. Making Meaning is a podcast by the Cohere Collective, here to help guide you along your path to make meaning in a way that makes sense for you. This week, I am joined by speaker and author Jessica Fein. Jessica and I jump into her story in this episode, which she has conveniently written in her beautiful memoir, Breathtaking. That, of course, is in the description down below if you are interested in checking it or the rest of her work out. But this episode talks about what it means to be a woman, to be a wife, to be a mother, and the expectation that those roles and archetypes can place on us and how they weigh on our relationships. Quick content warning before jumping in. We do talk a lot about grief, child death, and pregnancy difficulties. So if any of those topics are going to be particularly upsetting to you, please listen with care. I believe that is all I have. So as always, let's take a deep breath. And get started. Jessica, thank you so much for being here with me today and being so generous with your time and energy. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
I'm excited too. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So to get us started, the first question I always like to ask is just, what is one thing you're grateful for right now?
I am grateful that it is absolutely glorious outside today. I'm sitting in a place where I am looking out at just a bunch of trees, and it's one of these days that is so great, end of summer, where it's like not sweltering, but it's also warm enough to be outside in just a t-shirt. So, it's the little things, and this is certainly something to be grateful for.
Absolutely. I love that. Yes, I'm thinking about, so I'm in Texas. I quite remember where you are, but it's like the sweltering summer heat. I absolutely understand because you step outside and it's like you need to be in a body of water for this to be
Yeah.
bearable.
Yeah. No, I'm near Boston, so we definitely
Okay.
do get the four seasons.
Yes, which is really lovely. Well, second question, just to really break our conversation open, is what is your story? And that is a hefty question. So, whatever you feel called to speak to in this moment is exactly right. And we will go from there.
Okay, well, the good news is that my story is something I just wrote. So it's very top of mind, right? So my memoir, Breathtaking, has been out for a few months. And that's really the story of making, loving, and losing family, which is kind of the story of my life. So I start with meeting my husband in college, and we dated for 10 years before we got married. So we really wanted to make sure it was right. And we ultimately got married in our late 20s and set about trying to make a family, which we thought we'd do in the fun way, right? But that didn't exactly work out. And so we became increasingly creative with the interventions that we undertook and really worked out for about 5 years, did like everything you can possibly imagine and probably some things you can't imagine in order to try to make a family. And somewhere around year 4, decided to explore adoption. And once we did that, we really fell in love with the idea of adoption and never really looked at it as like second choice. For us, it was something we got really, really into and excited about, and ultimately ended up adopting 3 kids from Guatemala. And we thought, okay, the tough part's over. Little did we know at the time, and it took many years to figure out, that our second child, our daughter Dahlia, had an ultra rare degenerative disease. And that is her disease was called MERF syndrome, myoclonic epilepsy, ragged red fibers. It's a form of mitochondrial disease. So she was diagnosed with that at age 5. And That is pretty much the beginning of the story. When you say, what's your story? The beginning of how I, in many ways, became who I am today. In many ways, how I learned that there are things that we can't control, that there are things that we can't fix. And yet, even in the context of uncertainty and tragedy, we can create a life of joy and meaning. And that's really the story of my book and of my life.
Absolutely. And I think that in reading Breathtaking, which really is a gorgeous book, you do such a beautiful job of communicating this idea of choice, right? That you just spoke to, that in the face of all of these things, human agency is what persists. And we always have the ability to choose what we do next. And I think that that is just such a profound message, especially for people going through grief or
Mhm.
hardship, but also one that we're not hearing all that often. Um, I do want to, before we dive more into this grief piece, because I think that it is so important and how it's tied up and tangled up with love, um, I want to go back to having dated your husband for 10 years. Like, let's just start there, because I love that. And I think as a young person, um, I'm seeing the spectrum of friends who get married after having been dating for a year, and friends who get married and or have been dating, and marriage is not necessarily even a priority, but they're just dating and still doing life together. What was that decision like for you and
Okay, I just have to tell you, I
that
have done
experience?
so many conversations about this, and you are the first person to ask me that. So thank you. I love that. That's
You're
a fun,
welcome.
different thing to talk about. So let's see. We met sophomore year of college, and we had some really, great years dating at University of Michigan. And in fact, we're going to be in Ann Arbor next week, so it's always fun to go back there together. And let's see, then we had a hiatus. I have to be honest. We had a hiatus where I moved to Washington, D.C., and he moved to Seattle. And so we did kind of see other people for about a year and a half in there, though we were still in touch. And after that, I ended up moving to Seattle. Now, my mother would have told you I followed Rob, my husband, out there. And I always denied it. I always said, no, I moved because I had a friend who was moving there and I wanted to be on the West Coast and this and that. You know, Probably, sort of, kind of, I followed him out there. In any event, he did pick me up at the airport, even though we had been seeing other people. And we did get back together that night. Am I telling you a little more than you wanted to know, or are we good
No, I
here?
love it. I love it.
So then we were in Seattle and I stayed there for 2 years. And then I was like, oh my God, Seattle's like rainy and depressing. And my whole family's on the East Coast. And I just wasn't really a fan. He loved it. But I was like, I'm going back to Boston. And this time he followed me across the country. So he came and then we moved in together. I got to tell you, I mean, it was never up until like when we moved in together, I was always kind of like, this might work out, this might not. Like, it was not
Yeah.
one of these things of like, you're my life partner, but I'm not ready. I was just, we were in our 20s. It felt very young. We were figuring out careers and other things. And we lived together for a couple of years then before we got engaged. And it's interesting, we got engaged very soon after my first major loss. My first major loss was my sister. I was 27 and she was 30. And somehow going through that together, I think just after that, it was kind of like we knew we were going to be together forever.
Mm,
It was really unexpected in terms of that loss. It really changed the way I saw the world. I think it changed the way he saw the world. It brought us together in a much more serious way, I guess, is I would say. We had now this like little bubble we had been living in was burst with the
mm,
big hefty dose of reality. And I think
sure.
we were both changed pretty profoundly by that. And so, yeah, 10 years almost to the month, 10 years after we met, we got
Wow.
married. And
No,
it feels like such a long time ago, makes me feel so old.
no, no, no. I think that is just beautiful because also it's just something I've been really thinking about a lot as well as being in Texas. And there is such a marriage culture and a expectation, especially put upon young women. Um, and so I just have a lot of admiration for people who are very intentional about spending time with their partner significantly before getting married. But also, I love how you're like, it wasn't even like we were thinking about it. We were
No.
just being kids in our 20s because we're in our 20s.
Exactly. It's interesting because, you talk about the expectation of marriage. One of the things that I've been reading a lot about lately and hearing a lot about lately is the expectation of having children.
Yes.
And that's such an interesting thing. I've been reading more by women in particular who have chosen not to have kids. And that always seems to me to be just very, very interesting and brave because I still
Mm,
think there is an expectation. Once you get married, people say, "Oh, when you're having kids, I don't know, why are you waiting so long?" All this kind. There's just an expectation, and
yes.
I think that many people don't ever even ask themselves honestly, "Is that what I want to do with my life?" And so it's just interesting. And obviously, it's been in the zeitgeist a lot more recently. But it's interesting when you talk about the expectation of marriage. I think there's an expectation of marriage, but I think just as much so there's an expectation of then you're going to have kids.
If
And when you
not more
have
so.
somebody, when you then have, if you decide you want kids, and it then becomes such a challenge, it can feel really isolating.
Yes, I absolutely. As someone who has never been in that position, I can only imagine the feeling of that purely from, I mean, being a young person simply dealing with the pressure of like dating and marriage and the expectation from family and friends and culture and socialization for that can already feel very isolating to be making choices that are different than the most common ones around you. And then you bring kids into the question, and it's that is so wrapped up in feminine identity,
Hmm.
right? And for better or worse, it just is such a part of the gift and burden of womanhood is having that thrust upon us. And I guess I do want to ask, how did you know that you want kids? Because I completely agree that I think that it is having kids is just sort of the default, right? It's like that's what you do. Everyone has kids.
Right.
But I deeply believe that nothing should be the default, right? Like everything that you're choosing in your life, it's like, why is this um how is this adding to the story of who you are? How is this in alignment with the life that you want to live, the person you want to be, the impact you want to have, and what's going to bring you closer to your highest, best, most favorite self? And in that, it sounds like you're very much someone who was thinking about that in terms of, no,
I
maybe
gotta
not.
say, no,
Okay.
I don't think I ever really asked those deep questions of myself. I think it was just kind of the expectation.
Mm,
I had two siblings. My husband came from three as well. I think both of us were just like, this is what you do. In fact, I remember one time early on when we were dating, he was like, I don't know if I want to have kids, I bring other people into this troubled world, one of those like things that people say sometimes. And
yes.
so and I remember being like, what? Like, it didn't occur to me that really this is something that we have choice over. It was totally the default. It was what you did. And then, of course, once we started on the journey, it was like, became so all consuming.
Sure. Sure. So then entering into this journey, tell me more about that isolation. And I another thing that's like coming up for me to ask is also the grief of this being hard, right?
Mhm.
I do think that there is likely, again, as someone who has not experienced this, so please correct me if I am wrong at any point. Um, but I would have to imagine that thinking that this thing that you've been told your whole life is like the most natural, most beautiful gift that a woman can give, and for whatever reason, you and your partner are struggling with that. What was the grief of that moment like in knowing this isn't going to be easy?
It is a really important question, and I've become so facile in the conversation around grief and understanding and trying to help others understand how
Hmm.
there is so much we grieve other than the death of people we know and love.
Yes.
I don't think I was really clued into that for a long time, and I've had so much loss and so many things to grieve, most notably, of course, in terms of the many, many losses. Obviously, you've read my book, so you know I lost parents and two siblings, and of course, my teenage daughter. But or not but and there are so many other losses, right? And fertility, going through that journey is, gosh, it's like a monthly loss, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so much ups and downs and roller coaster, and it's going to happen, it's not going to happen. I think we just kept plugging along. We were very, very private about it. One of the things I've learned for sure as I've gotten older is it's really hard for people to support you when they have no idea what's going on, right?
Mm,
Like, you're not going to get help if nobody knows. And I was very, very private at the time. It was a while ago. People didn't talk about it as much as they do now. And I thought
right.
this was pretty much like the single most personal thing somebody could be going through. Why in the world would I talk about it with anybody?
Right.
But then, of course, you're suffering and nobody knows. Even my best friends didn't know. And it's funny, actually, the first person I told was a colleague at work, which might seem weird. But at the time, I worked in corporate for my whole career. I was 26 years in the same job in corporate, which I've just
Wow.
recently left. But I was going on a work trip. And at the time, there was a rule for the company that you had to share a room with a colleague. And I was giving myself injections, and I had needles and things
Right.
refrigerated, and the whole thing. And I was like, oh my God. And rather than go to HR and say, like, hey, I need my own room because I'm going through this, I decided to tell this colleague of mine who was a friend. And it was really interesting because she was great about it. And she's, to this day, one of my closest friends. But um, I realized, once you start being vulnerable and sharing your story, your truth with other people, not only can they support you, but it lets them be more open about what they're going
Mm,
through. And in the workplace, it was an interesting one because I became a manager and I had a large team, and being able to share some of what I was going on with people on my team, I think made them feel even more comfortable and more invested because they felt like they could bring their whole selves with them to the workplace.
mm. No, I think that's such a beautiful point that isolation breeds further isolation,
Yeah,
right? And it takes such an act of bravery to be vulnerable, but that it really is the birthplace of connection. I'm pulling that straight from Brene Brown. I don't know if you're familiar with her work,
sure.
but um, it really and truly is. And I think that grief kind of wraps all of these things up and in with each other, right? And you were saying that you're very well versed in this
Very
conversation
well
around
versed, yes,
grief,
and I
right?
will say
Because
grief is, I'm actually preparing to give a TED Talk on the intersection of loneliness and grief literacy because, um, grief is really such a lonely, lonely place to be.
mm,
And it's because we don't share it. We don't know how to respond to
right,
people who are grieving. We don't know what to say. We don't know what to do. We're uncomfortable. We're awkward. So we run away.
right.
And it's a real opportunity to connect on a
Yes,
deeper level.
absolutely. I've really been kind of diving into grief recently too. I'm about to go on a big move, and a lot of my life is changing. And I've always felt like, kind of the paradox of change is this construction deconstruction, right? Like they always happen in tandem, and yet there's always a grieving process there. And as I've of course, the five stages of grief and Elizabeth Kubler Ross's work comes up. But one thing that I am just fascinated by that I have to ask you about because, of course, the name of the podcast is Making Meaning. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had a student named, I believe it's David Kessler, who suggested a sixth stage of grief, which was making meaning out of this grief, and that is actually the final stage of how we not finalize grief, but reach a place of complacency also isn't the right word, but maybe like stability with this process, right? That it is not quite as tumultuous as it once was. Talk to me about the making
Okay,
meaning
I
piece.
have a lot to say about that because number
Please.
one, there are no five stages of grief. So Kubler-Ross,
Yes.
first of all, we should all be on the same page. This is outdated. Her, first of all, the five stages of grief were not about loss of a loved one. She was talking about being diagnosed with a terminal illness. And so that's something that
Yes.
society has gotten wrong. So that's number one. Number two, it is not linear.
Mm-hmm.
Number three, we don't move from stage one to stage two to stage three, obviously saying it's not linear. Everything happens all at once and there's no getting over it. We learn to integrate it. And this is a really, really important thing that people who themselves are grieving, but more important, or at least equally important, when you're supporting somebody else in their grief, there should not be an expectation, geez, it's 3 years and she still hasn't gotten over it.
Right.
I, for one, would never want to, quote, get over my grief because
Right.
the people I've lost are part of who I am. I
Yes.
carry them with me every day. I carry that grief proudly with me every day. So I would say it's not about getting through it or getting over it. I would say it's about learning to integrate it. How do you move on? How do you carry on, I should say, in a way that is making meaning, to use the name of your podcast, bringing these people with you, honoring who they remain to you. It's not just who they were. And how do
Right.
you keep them as a meaningful part? I mean, for me, everything I do, I'm walking with my family as a major part of that. The work that I do, even, the celebrations I have, the joy I have. What I always say is grief and joy are mingling.
Hmm.
It's always there. They can live together, they can hold hands, they can sit next to each other at the dinner table, and they do. And it's not
Yes.
just the sad moments, but it's the happy moments where I feel my people most with me.
Right. Which I'm sure, and I do think in the happy moments can also be where sometimes we feel the most grief because it is this person is here, but they're not here,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
And yes, thank you so much for clarifying on Kubler-Ross's work that it is that personal journey, and something that the kind of spectrum of media and research around grief has really misquoted and misused a lot, and that this is not linear and there should be no timeline, right? I do think that there is something really beautiful in holding it as a piece of who we are as well.
Mhm.
Um, but I love your word choice of integration, right? That this is not something that should ever be required to get over, right? It is like we are all going through grief of different things, and everyone's process is valid and worthy and a part of who they are and their story, and everyone's story is worth telling and listening to. And in that making meaning piece, where I suppose, where did you find integration coming in the most to have your grief not disappear, not be solved or fixed, but become a more sustainable part of who you are?
Yeah. So because I have lost so many people, um, it is on me to keep their memories alive, to keep their stories alive. And I take that actually quite literally in my writing.
Mm,
Um, and I think that at this point, it's really now for me having left, as I mentioned, corporate and really focusing more on the writing and on my podcast, which is called I Don't Know How You Do It. something that is of great interest to me is to talk to people about how we do make lives of joy and meaning within the context of uncertainty, tragedy, and loss. And there are lots of ways. So first of all, I'm sitting here right now. You see just me and my book cover. What you don't see is behind my computer, I have 19 pictures of my daughter. Okay. So she is with me always. When I feel like I really just can't, like, oh my God, I can't, whatever the thing is, I think about her and I think about how she had this insidious disease. It was an insidious degenerative disease. She had all functionality taken away from her. In her 17 years, she lost the ability to walk and to talk, to eat, and to breathe without a ventilator. And yet she got up, got out with assistance, with physical assistance, but spiritually, she didn't need any assistance. She was leading the way in terms of, look, this is what I have, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to spread joy and I'm going to live and I'm going to be feisty and silly and happy and caring. And so I honor her and have learned from her. And that is how I have integrated her into my really day to day existence. I would say
Mm.
more, at least as profoundly as any of the others. I'll give you another example. My father was a writer and he left a letter for me to read after he died. And in it, he said, in the end, I would have liked to have known how the story ends. But the truth
Mm.
is, the story never ends. All that changes is who gets to write it. I hand my pen to you. Write well. And that's what I do now. I write my stories, so that's how I've integrated him. So there are different ways that we integrate, when I am hosting and being kind of a big presence in a room, which I am known to be sometimes, I'm integrating my mother because that's who she was,
Mm.
and it's not saying I'm being these other people and not being
Right.
myself. It's that these pieces of them are such a huge part of me. And I'm really aware of it. My mother's name was Zelda. I mean, how could you not be a big presence with a name
Yeah.
like Zelda, right? And so when I'm being the most Zelda, I feel her.
Yeah. Uh, I love that. I was actually just writing yesterday letters to some of my very dear friends as because I'm about to move, as kind of like we're not going to see each other 2, 3 times a week anymore. And we really are, I am a big believer in chosen family. And so I was writing these letters, and the thing I was really called to speak to was the gratitude for the pieces of them that are now within me. Right. And
Yeah.
so I just absolutely relate to what you're saying. And it's like the bravery that I have with me is this one friend, and the vulnerability that I'm called to hold now is inspired by this other friend, and
Mhm.
this combination of all of these things. And it's not that you are cosplaying as this
Right.
person, it's inspiration, which even in that word takes me back to your book. And I think this is one of the most, just as a writer, gorgeous uses of language, and is the title of your book breathtaking, right? That what a difficult experience to go through grief, that it truly takes your breath away. It's the feeling of falling flat on your back and your breath being knocked out of you, right? And yet, how do we get through these hard moments? Taking
Yeah.
breaths. And the idea of like inspiration, being inspired, is taking breath from something. Like that truly is the etymology of that. And in this way, you are being inspired in taking breath from these people that have breathed life into you. I would love to talk more about this kind of symbol that you use.
I love what you said about the title, and I love my title so much, and I love the book cover so much too.
It is beautiful.
And yes, yes, and yes, everything you said. And then the other meaning of the book is, of course, this idea of beauty. When we say
Mm.
something's breathtaking, and I felt like there was so much beauty that we created over the course of the journey and my daughter's life, and that was yet the other meaning. So breathtaking had so many meanings for me as as I was thinking of the title of this book.
I love that beauty piece as well. And the cover is also
I mean, it's
stunning,
ridiculous,
right?
right? I can say that because I didn't, obviously that was the publisher and the artist who did that. And I love it so much. And I'm so glad it turned out this way because it wasn't up to me. And it was between this concept and another concept. And I really didn't like the other concept. And I was like, oh God, no. And they're
Yeah.
like, well, we want to respect what you want, but, it is a business decision. They were very, very collaborative and they did all kinds of focus groups. And I was like, so hoping because this book is so personal. It's so my story. And I was
Yes,
like, I've got to love it.
absolutely. You should be deeply in love with
Yeah.
it. And I think even the cover and the title and just so much of the book honors paradox. Um,
Yes.
Talk to me about that. Like
Yes. That
the
is to me is one of the huge takeaways. And you're such a careful reader to have picked up on all of these themes that you're
mm,
talking about. But for me, that was a huge thing, right? I would not have thought that you could be in the greatest throes of despair and have joy. I would have thought those
mm,
two things were mutually exclusive. And I discovered that they are not at all mutually exclusive and that they become more powerful because of the other. So that was a
yes.
huge paradox that I came to understand at a profound level. And there are so many more. I mean, the idea of you can be part of a vibrant community and feel alone. Those two things can be
Yeah,
true at the same time, right? I mean, so many things that it's not either or, it's both
right.
and, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, the if grief is not a paradox, I don't know what is, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, even what you mentioned earlier, grief and joy are mingling, right?
Mhm.
And I love the word mingling. I'm such a word nerd. So
Mhm.
I'm like, ooh, that word choice is so juicy. But it really is, because when we think of mingling, you don't think of like perfect integration. You think of this mix and jumble and kind of uh concoction of these things, or
Sure, and
chit-chatting
sometimes
back and
one of them is
forth.
braver than the other and is kind of shouldering the other one out of the way, and sometimes they're just holding hands, and sometimes one of them's sitting quietly in the corner, but it's still there.
Absolutely. It is still a part of this picture. Another piece of the title, I suppose it's the subtitle, is the phrase broken genes. And of course, this is, I'm assuming, a nod to your daughter's Murph syndrome. Um, but when I read broken genes, I think a lot about generational trauma as
Mhm.
well as epigenetics and all of the science that we're kind of learning about how trauma from 5 generations ago can really be stored in our bodies today. Um, but then when we offer into this conversation the beauty of adoption, how that really changes that conversation. Talk to me about this idea of broken genes
Yeah,
and
well, I think,
generational
you
trauma.
really nailed it. For us, there's so much of this story does have to do with this idea of genetics and, that we were not able to have a biological child. And of course, Dahlia's disease was a genetic disease. And yet, those broken genes of us not being able to have a kid, if you want to consider that broken genes, are what led us to our children who were meant to be our children and we were meant to be their parents. So, this idea of obviously at the heart of it in our case was broken genes that were, just absolutely, absolutely tragic. And again, with the other losses, seeing that happen over and over again. And it's interesting because so much of us spend our lives in fear of like, okay, what if I get, things that might happen to us, quote
Right.
unquote, out there. And when I look at the 6 main losses in my life, they were all from something that was inside of the person all along,
Mm,
so it was all inside. And then we think, well, I don't want to do that because something might happen. And,
right.
we never know. We never know.
Mm-mm. It is truly, it is all unpredictable. And in what you just said, it's that they were still meant to be your kids, right? And I do love that. Where does that kind of faith and conviction come from in this meant to be? And is there a belief in fate, in destiny, in this kind of cosmic intertwining of you and your husband and these kiddos that became and
Yeah,
are
and
yours?
I love to think about it that way. I love to think about a cosmic intertwining because, when I think about the five of us, my husband, myself, and our three kids, we all chose each other.
Yes.
And that in many ways is more compelling to me than, it just kind of happened and whatever. And I love this idea that the five of us chose each other. And even though they were babies, I think they chose us too,
Mm,
So I don't know if I think that, I certainly don't believe there's somebody up there with the big whiteboard, drawing the whole thing out and
sure.
deciding these people are going to be together. My husband always says if these children did not end up with us, he envisions one day he'd be like at a mall or, on a train or something, and he'd see our children with whoever they ended up with, and he'd be like, what are our kids doing with somebody else? He believes it that strongly. And I kind of love that. So
Yeah. No, that is so beautiful that you, and I think we've all experienced this, probably not to the same degree, right? But this feeling of soul connection to someone
mhm.
else, that it's, you just see someone or you have one conversation and it's like, yep, yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah,
have that mostly, you know what? I have that more with my girlfriends who are like my soul sisters than I have with anybody else. And I can think back to a lot of the, first moments of meeting, I have a terrific bevy of girlfriends, and I can remember how drawn I was to them and how much we clicked, and it was some kind of soul connection for sure.
yeah.
I definitely feel that most strongly with my girlfriends.
Mm. I absolutely agree. And I do want to go back to this concept of chosen family, because this is something that I am extremely passionate about. Is even if you have blood family, right? No one is entitled to you, to your energy, to your peace, to your presence. I Just because they are in your family does not mean you're required to engage, especially if they're a harmful person, right? And I am so lucky to have two parents that I would choose lifetime and lifetime again to be my parents. And I tell them all the time, it's like, yeah, we're blood family, but we're chosen family,
I
right?
love that.
Because not everyone has that relationship too. But then also these friends that become family
Mhm.
are just so powerful. And I think that we really see this concept in a lot of marginalized and oppressed communities of chosen family. And so now thinking about this concept coming through in this world of grief and hardship as well, do you see any connection between chosen family and shared struggle?
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, there are people that I relate to and that we connect instantly because we have been through things that others find unimaginable.
Right.
So, whether that's watching your child have an insidious degenerative disease, whether that's bearing the death of your child, whether that's having gone through, multiple losses, there's a language you speak, there's a humor you're allowed to share that you can't share outside of that because people raise eyebrows. So I would say there's definitely connections that can be born, and the opposite of that is true as well. There are people who just don't get it, and then it's like, I have no time for you. I will also say that I'm very grateful that so many of the people in my chosen family are people who have been part of my life forever because they know all the players. Right? I
Mm.
always think, God, it'd be hard to make a really great friend now because I'd have to explain too much, So I'm so lucky.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got friends from first grade still, and they know
Mm.
my people. They know my stories. Sometimes they even know my stories better than I do, and they'll say, "Remember when your mom did such and such?" And I'm like, "Wait, what?"
What?
You know?
Yeah, they know all the lore. Um and I think that's so beautiful, and it is difficult to kind of there's a difference between meeting someone and feeling really seen and sharing these memories, and someone who was there for the
Somebody who's there,
memories,
yeah.
right? And I've been with my therapist for almost 14 years now, the same woman.
Wow.
And I think about that all the time, that I'm like, I cannot get another therapist.
You cannot, you cannot. You're stuck for life.
She knows everything,
Yeah.
right? And it is so funny because we'll be having a conversation, we'll be like, and this is happening, and she's like, well, remember this thing from 5 years ago and how these are actually related? And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, you just like cracked the code. But there is something so special about that. One thing I also want to talk about, because I think grief inevitably makes us think about this, and our conversation about fate, you said, I don't believe there's someone up in the sky with a whiteboard necessarily storyboarding out exactly what's happening. What do you think is up there?
Hmm. I think we get to decide what we want to believe in. And
Mm,
I have decided that there are other planes of existence. It gives me comfort to believe that, and so why not believe it?
yeah.
Um, I don't think there is a, a puppet master. I don't think there is something that is necessarily written in stone that this is the way it's going to happen, and there was no way you could have changed it because this was the way it was going to happen. But
Sure.
I believe that energetically there is some kind of continuation, and I want to believe it, so I do.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think in this question of spirituality, religion, faith, whatever title we want to place on it, at the end of the day, it should come down to, does it make you a better person?
Does it bring you comfort?
Does it bring you comfort? Yeah. Is this something that allows you to move forward?
Yeah.
And I do think, similarly to our conversation earlier about having kids, that a lot of us have, well, this is the default. This is the one that most people have. And so I'm just going to take that and hang on to it. But I know for me, I've been open about this on the podcast. Being raised in Southern Christianity actually brought me a lot of stress and distress and worry, and was very anxiety riddled. And letting go of that was actually such a comfort, to be able
Mm,
to say, I can curate a spiritual practice that honors the higher power that I believe in, that
mhm.
honors the self in other and other within the self, and the cosmic mystery that exists. And that brings me a lot of comfort, right? More
Yeah.
than thinking about, different things work for different people. So I don't want to pass judgment on anything that anyone's decided for themselves. But did you ever have this moment of interrogation within your spirituality? Or how did you come to this place of, I'm choosing this for my own comfort?
Well, it's very interesting because my religion is very much a part of who I am. I'm Jewish, and it's very much a part of who I
Mm,
am culturally, and it is very much a part of my identity. It is the context in which I learned what it means to be a human being. However, I'm not religious. I don't go to services. I don't, and so for me, it's very comfortable. I feel an instant, familiarity.
yeah.
It's very much the context in which I grew up. So that is separate from the idea of God. And I think that that's one of the interesting things about a lot of religions are very much intertwined, right?
Hmm.
Judaism was is more of a people, right? Whereas I mean, look, I think you could talk about the extremes of any religion, and it's going to be,
Sure.
every single religion has its extremes, but it's based, in my experience, on the idea of community more than on a strict set of beliefs. Again, I want to be really clear because that's my experience. And there are a lot of
Absolutely.
people in every religion who have different experiences, right? But for me, it is about that. It is about community. And even if we want
Mm,
to talk about grief and loneliness, which seems to be a theme that we're circling around here, Judaism does a lot to provide community in the
Mm,
context of grief, whether that's the first 7 days where you have the official mourning period, or the first 30 days, which is yet another mourning period. So, I think that religious communities can provide comfort, can provide outside even of the, dogma, so to speak.
absolutely. And I think you're spot on in saying that, calling this distinction between religion and spirituality out,
Mhm.
right? That 100%. I think a big reason why so many people stay with religions or maybe don't question them is because of the community it provides, right? And as someone who is not Jewish, it is something that I have seen in some friends that it really is such a vibrant community of
Yeah,
people. But I do think that there is something separate from the ritual and community that different religions offer and the spirituality of your individual connection with source.
mhm.
Has kind of been the word I've landed on to be a catch-all, right? Um, so I think that's really beautiful, and that I think we can hold both too, right? I think something that has gotten so rigid is this idea that, well, if you're a practicing member of this religion, that has to look one way.
Right.
And it just does not,
It
because
does not.
no human being is one way. Um,
Yeah, it's so funny. Years and years and years ago, I remember it was Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. And typically, I grew up going to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. And I remember, it was so many years ago, my husband saying, "Why don't we have a beautiful arboretum in Boston. Do you want to go to the arboretum? We'll go on a walk. We'll make our own kind of." And I remember being like, "What? We can do that?" And so it is, as you pointed out earlier, very freeing when you realize you can make your own, you can make it up for yourself and do what works for yourself.
yeah, absolutely. It The freeing is, yes, what a beautiful word. How has spirituality intertwined with your grief? Is that part of this discovery of comfort? And how do these two things talk to one
I think
another?
for me, the idea outside of religion, but when we think of spirituality in terms of kind of getting deeper within ourselves, I think that that's come as a result of what I've been through and being able
Mm,
to sit in quiet more, which was something that was not comfortable for me. Really learning about breathing, as the title of the book. Um, so I think some of those kinds of spiritual things, appreciating things more, for sure. I appreciate things more. And I think all of that is a part of spirituality.
mm, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think it's interesting to see how people puzzle piece spirituality
Mhm.
together. I think it's so beautiful. As we kind of approach the end of our conversation here, I do have one more question, kind of about your family dynamic now. One thing that I've really been experiencing, even though my family has not had a loss within our immediate atomic family, that our roles are still shifting and changing, especially now that me and I have an older brother are adults, and he now has a partner, and we're, you know, stepping into new identities, and how that has shifted and changed over time, I think has been really confusing at some points, but also really beautiful in others. What has this kind of reconfiguration looked like for you and your people, with this added consideration of um, Dahlia and how she is a part of all of
Yeah.
you, right?
I think that we are such a tight unit in so many ways because for so, so, so many years, we lived this life, like I said earlier, that others couldn't begin to imagine, couldn't begin to understand unless they really wanted to.
Hmm.
And of course, people will say all that, I can't imagine. And it's like, well, try.
Yeah.
But,
Right.
we lived on the precipice for
Mm.
a long time in a very intense situation. So there is an understanding we all have. And I think we went through that together. So yeah, I think that something like this either brings people together or tears them apart. I mean, we know that more than half of couples who have a special needs child, let alone a medically complex child, split up. So for us, it did the opposite. And I think it really bound us together. Now, of course, things are changing. My little guy's going to go off to college. And, we each deal with grief in our own way. I will tell you, one of the things that was so surprising to me with the first loss and almost an immediate realization was even when you lose the same person and have the same quote, like official relationship, meaning like when my sister died, I had another sister. So each of us lost the same person. We each lost our sister. And yet, who she was to each of us was so different. I mean, at the most basic level, she was my older sister. She was my other sister's younger sister. But the point is, grief is so, so, so isolating because each loss means something very, very different to each person. So yes, it bound us closely together. And then I think we're each on our own path, very much so, in terms
Mm,
of how we integrate it and how we carry on.
yeah, absolutely. What has that been like for you in having lost your sister and then also seeing your other kids go through that same experience, right?
Yes.
Which,
And that's such a good question. And I sometimes remind them of that. I say, I do like I really get it
yeah.
because I lost my sister. And I will tell you, it's something else that's very interesting to me is my parents lost their daughter. Now, both of my parents died before my daughter did. So I never got to talk this through with them.
Mm,
But I witnessed it for many years and I
right.
lived with it. And I watched how they integrated it and how they carried on. I didn't do that in any kind of deliberate way, like I am studying your loss, but I
Right.
realized that they both were profoundly changed and they both went on to have lives of meaning.
Mm,
So I saw that and I lived that. And so this idea that I've seen as front row as you can get what it was
yeah.
like to lose a child before I lost my own, and that I then can share this understanding of what it's like to lose a sibling with my children. Now, the difference is I didn't live through so many years of uh, living on the precipice of the drama that my other two kids lived with. But yeah, we are definitely a family of loss. I will tell you that I have people call me Shiva girl. Shiva is, for those who might not know, in Judaism, that's the 7 days of mourning, official mourning. And yeah, I've been like I get all kinds of things. Yes, the funeral director's like, I'm going to give you a parking space with your name on it. I mean, there is a lot of loss going on.
How does that feel? I would have to imagine, like you mentioned earlier, there is a sense of uh, gallows humor that is helpful to this process to relating, but also for something that socially has such a difficult connotation to be such a part of your identity.
Yeah, you know what? I appreciate the recognition because it is more than most people bear. For example, I have, as I mentioned, a lot of friends, and for many, many years, I was the only one who had lost a parent, let alone two. Or, I'm the only one who's lost a sibling, let alone two. So I appreciate the recognition. I really do. We want to feel seen, right? At the end of the day, that's all we all want is to feel
Mm,
seen and understood. And if you're not going to be able to see and understand what I have lost, then you're not seeing me.
mm. I want to sit with that for a second, right? That we all want to be seen. And so much of seeing someone else is just bearing witness,
So
right?
much. Hmm.
Just that. Well, I do want to make sure to hold space for you to talk about one, a little bit about your book and everything else you have going on, but also if there is anything that, in light of our conversation, what we talked about, what we didn't get to, is there something you're like, we got to go here, or
No, this has been such a beautiful, well-rounded conversation. And I really appreciate your careful and thoughtful questions. And I love connecting with people. So if any of your listeners want, find me on Instagram. My last name is Fein, but it's Fein, So the best place to kind of keep abreast of all the things I'm doing is on my website, which is jessicafeinstories.com. Jessica Fein, F like Frank, EIN, stories.com. Follow me on social, connect with me, let's talk. Oh, and I love being part of book groups. If anybody wants to read my book as part of their book group, that's one of my favorite things to do. I'll Zoom right in and have a conversation with people about it.
I love that. What a beautiful offering. And I also love that you have your little name thing, because I feel like so many of us, this is a total tangent, but have that little thing, because I'm like, I say Reese like the candy, Brown like the color.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
F like Frank, EIN. Yeah. And by the way, 9 times out of 10, I kid you not, I'll say, yes, fine. F like Frank, EIN. And then the person will say, oh, FINE.
Like, no.
Always. We just did that.
Yeah. We just covered it, but that's okay. That's so funny. Beautiful. If anyone wants to access Jessica at all, interested in reading her book, all information, social handles, the way to read her book, everything will be in the description down below, wherever you are accessing this podcast episode. Jessica, final question. What is one word to describe how you're feeling right now?
Does sleepy count?
Sure. I love it.
I'm a little sleepy right now. I'm not going to lie. I haven't been sleeping so well, but I would say I'm also, while I'm sleepy, I'm also really energized because, talking about the book, talking about the work that I'm doing now absolutely energizes me. So I would say, as we talked about, you can hold two seemingly opposing things together. I can be sleepy and energized at the same time.
Absolutely. Yes, you can. Honoring the paradox till the very end. Jessica, I cannot thank you enough for having this conversation with me, taking the time to do this and hold this space. I am so grateful.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for being here, and a huge thank you to Jessica for her time, openness, and vulnerability during this conversation. I really love, even in the midst of talking about really difficult, really hard things, and oftentimes the most difficult or change-drenched moments of people's lives, it can still be so full of joy because of the reflection and attitude that so many of my guests have towards these moments in their life, towards these inflection moments. And it just feels like such a privilege to be able to witness that and also witness them discussing it and having realizations about it. And this episode is not any different. I love getting to unpack that right next to and with and beside my guest. And also it always spurs those thoughts in me as well. So it's just a privilege. And thank you very much for being here and listening to this episode. If this is your first time here at the Cohere Collective, welcome. I am so very glad that you are here. If you enjoyed the episode, wherever you are listening, please give it a like, a review, a rating, subscribe, leave a comment, all of the things. Any way that you engage is the best way to support Making Meaning and the work that we are trying to do. If you are curious more about the Cohere Collective and the other things we do and offer, head over to www.thecoherecollective.com, and you can follow us across social media, all at the Cohere Collective, but Instagram is the #1 place you'll find us. You can, of course, also follow Jessica, linked below, and me on Instagram at Lillian Reese Brown. A big thank you to Tristan Morgan for making Meaning's theme music. You can find him on Instagram at Tristan Morgan. And a big thank you to Nicole Oesterreicher for making Meaning's art and podcast cover. You can find her on Instagram at Nicole O Creates and Nicole O Design. Right now, I am feeling reflective. I clearly, from the brief ramble at the beginning of this outro, I have just really been enjoying. I've had a lot of episodes, recording sessions kind of back to back recently, and it always puts me in a very reflective mood, but that always feels really wonderful to go take on the world and life afterwards from a place of intention and purpose after getting to listen to the stories of these amazing, wonderful people. Thank you so much for being here. And as always, I hope you feel like you are living more coherently. Until next time, love.